Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Haydn Smith. I would like to welcome you to BAFTA and this film award session on sound. It's somewhat fitting that we're in the David Lean room because this is the epic session of the whole day. Essentially, we have members, representatives from each of the 5 nominated films, and rather than having all of us squeezed on one single sofa, we're going to have a series of 5 individual 15-minute sessions. And so to go first is First Man. Welcome to Sainsbury's, First Man. Oh. Grab a mic. Right, okay. Actually, for this first 15-minute session, I'd quite like to divide it into domestic and technology. One of the things that struck me the first time I saw First Man was not a film that was set in the late 1960s. I felt like I was watching a film that had been made in the late 1960s. I was just wondering if you could talk about the conversations you had with Damien, actually about the domestic scenes, first of all, before we get on to the actual lunar mission.
Yes, Damien wanted those scenes to be very documentary-like, and in fact, in preparation for the film, he had watched a lot of documentaries that were made in the 1960s, and actually gave us a list of films that to reference. And he wanted the approach for sound editing to be very realistic, very gritty, and to match what we see. So when what you're seeing, there's a lot of grain, there's a lot of shaky movement, and the sound had to be analogous to that.
And just in terms of intimacy, I wonder if there was a conversation, because as we move later to the actual lunar mission, there's such attention to pay to the minutiae of the mission. And I felt the same thing again in Neil Armstrong's house and objects in the house, and there's something very tactile about these scenes.
One of the earlier conversations with Damien is also talking about the one of the qualities for the sound that he wanted was how tactile he wants the soundtrack to feel, almost like a Terrence Malick film, just to show how close we are to the characters. And it's also shown in how it was shot, like what Millie said, it's very cinema verite. So, you know, with the Foley and the dialogues, you know, for the sound mix, we kind of try to give it besides the greedy, it's almost like an unpolished feel in the sound, just to match, you know, it's almost sound like a 16mm home movie. And also, you know, so in the sound mix, maybe, you know, maybe we mixed it a little bit more intimate so that we'll contrast that by the time we get to the mission scenes.
And also in the, you know, inside the house, actually Neil's house, there's a little bit of, if you listen carefully, there's a little bit of camera noise that we could have gotten rid of, but it really helped with the documentary style of the film and trying to differentiate, you know, being Neil as a person between that and being Neil as an astronaut. And it kind of offset, but if you listen carefully, there's a little bit of gate clank or whatever it would be called, which is, I think, really kept it interesting and keeping it real.
And in terms of research, could you talk a little bit about the level of research that you had to go into, but both in recreating the 60s milieu and then obviously moving on and working with NASA?
Mm-hmm. So for us, we got involved early during pre-production, and besides the the reading the book by Dave Hansen, I think it's a very extensively researched book. We also read and watched films regarding the space race period during that time, and you know, part of it is also talking to some of the NASA consultants, or for myself, I managed to, you know, through a Foley editor, managed to ask a former Apollo Gemini astronaut, Jim Lovell, who was a part of the Apollo 13 mission. So I sent him a bunch of questions to see like how it sounded during the launch or in the space capsule, or how it sounded like from inside the spacesuit. So he kind of wrote back all the answers for as much as what they could remember so long ago. And so from what we gleaned off, it's like how much of a big of a constant roar the Saturn V launch was, and how little sounds you could hear when you're suited up. You basically only hear your breathing and the air hiss created by the life support system on the spacesuit.
Which is interesting because a lot of that is the same thing in production. So when they're shooting the scenes and they have the bubble on in their suit, they had air going into the suit exactly as they would, as if they were in space, which I didn't know much about, but Frankie has been into NASA and that whole thing since he was 8 years old. So it was, I talked to him about futzes and about air and, what should be in there. And he explained the whole thing to me, which was pretty awesome.
Which welcome to do.
Well then, at my age, I only remember half. It was a thrill to be work on a film that puts you in that time and place. So I was very excited to work around that era, the late 1960s U.S. space program. So I took a shot at calling the Smithsonian and the National Air and Space Museum, and they made a mistake and picked up the phone. They had curator. So I said, I want to touch everything. And they didn't say no. So it was exciting. We looked for capsules. There's 7 of them that returned. We looked for capsules that were on the ground and not in plexiglass. So long and the short of it, we got out to one thing led to a next thing and a next thing and next thing, and it really kind of felt like dominoes, and people are very excited to be part of the film. And curators actually let us go in, and some of the highlights, we went to Frederica, Delaware, and worked with the original spacesuit manufacturer for the Apollo program. At that facility, we were able to record. We were really after trying to get the environment of the astronauts. What did they hear? The communication stuff, we have miles of, hours and hours of that. But when you're in the suit that kept you alive on the lunar surface, what was that experience sonically? So we were able to work with John Young's Apollo 10 flight helmet, bubble helmet. So when Gosling's locking up in the clean room and those helmets are going on, that's actually John Young's helmet. It's no longer with us. So it really, it's really a pleasure to have that stuff live on, live forward, go forward. The internal airflow was a very specific sound, and that was highlighted in the movie as well, in the very quiet areas. We were able to go to, we also stopped in Huntsville, Alabama, where they developed the Saturn V rocket itself, and they had one of the LEM simulators there. So they took the plexiglass off, and we did every switch, dial, stick you can imagine. So those were actually, that environment was used in training, so Neil and Buzz were in that environment, in that specific unit. We worked out here in California with Edwards Air Force Base. We worked with Joe Walker's X-15 suit. So in the scene where they get to altitude and 0 Gs in the very opening scene, and there's movement happening, that's actually Joe Walker's spacesuit. So all those little nuances are the real deal.
And then you have the extraordinary wall of sound that's the launch, and we don't have Saturn V rockets firing up into space every couple of months now. Was this a mix of archived sound and other recordings, or improvisation on a grand scale?
Yeah, so for this, same thing during production, because we had a lot of cooperation and participation from Neil's sons, and they were there during the Apollo launch for the dad, and they remembered, and they told Damien, the director, that it would be great to properly recreate the sound of the Saturn V launch, because they felt like they haven't really heard it properly recreated in other films. So it was a pretty tall order for us. We went through all the NASA archives to check out all the Saturn V recordings. But I think because of how long ago that was, it was hard to get recordings that's like high enough quality. for us, but there's some distinct crackle in it. So that distinct crackle together with, because Saturn V is the world's most powerful rocket, but unfortunately, they don't launch that anymore. And we just lucked out that SpaceX was launching their biggest rocket to date, which is the Falcon Heavy. And they launched it so we recorded it last year in February. Also, I think it was the same launch pad at the Cape Canaveral where they launched the Apollo. And we were able to, blacked out, and we were able to place a bunch of microphones on the launch pad, like maybe 150, 200 yards away, just to try our luck to see if we could capture the close-up ignition or the fury of the launch, and other mics like a quarter mile away, 3 miles away, because different distances, the quality, the characteristics of the sound of the rocket differs. So all that together with that, a little bit of the archival stuff, and also we went to JPL in Pasadena, part of NASA, and recorded the acoustic test chamber, where they basically blast nitrogen gas into the chamber to simulate the acoustics inside a rocket during launch, so that they could test their hardware components to make sure they can survive the launch. So same thing. It created basically this intense low rumble that we could then feed it into the main speakers around, so we could feel the weight and the rumble and the shake of the launch. And so in order to capture all that low frequencies, one of the mics that we did was convert a subwoofer speaker into a microphone.
We took a 15-inch subwoofer speaker and used it as a microphone, so we placed 2 of them in there, and it just gave us another harmonic. So it wasn't traditional. JT read about it and turned us on, and we tested it, and we took it in amongst many microphones. Yeah. It was very interesting. It was this 6-inch hydrogen tube, or a tube that was about 6 inches in circumference. They forced this hydrogen gas in through a huge brass diaphragm that changes it into frequencies. So we got to see a spectrum analyzer that they worked with, and we got to see what it looked like, and obviously we couldn't be in the chamber with it because we wouldn't survive. So it was pretty interesting to just be part of that, and what we got back was pretty amazing.
Some bands recorded their kick drum that way, so I know it was real deep bass. So that's how it worked.
And I was going to say, Ai-Ling, when she was describing recording the Falcon Heavy, kept saying luck. We got lucky because apparently with the recordings, when you record rocket launches, luck is really important because
it gets scrubbed pretty often. And because of security, you got to set up your mics at least 24 hours beforehand if you're on the launch pad. So we had to set it up and set build timers so they could start recording on time and on schedule. But if it gets scrubbed, sometimes due to security reasons, they won't let you back on the launch pad to reset, or battery power.
And these scientists are really annoying that they don't like second takes. It's just why can't they just do the same thing again?
And with the Falcon Heavy, because it was the first maiden launch, and we've read if it goes bad, it could just explode. So we were trying to pick where's the safer spot. So none of our mics would just.
We would have taken the explosion too.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to move on. But can you please join me in thanking Frank Montano, Ai-Ling Lee, Mildred, Iatrou, Morgan, and Jon Taylor. Thank you. So quick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please, after you. Thank you. Thank you. We are next going to welcome the sound team for A Star Is Born to the stage, please. Hello. And this time around, I'm going to be a little more courteous and introduce the people at the beginning, not say their names at the end. So we have Tom Ozanich on the end. Then we have Dean Zupancic. And in between, we have Jason Ruder and Stephen Morrow. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
First of all, very, very technical question from my perspective. I read somewhere that the number of channels that were used for this film, around 61, something like that, is an extraordinary number compared to...
On production. I'm sure these guys did a lot more post-wise, but...
On production.
Yeah, during filming, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how that helped in the journey of the sound that we end up with?
Yeah, well, I think on the production side, we wanted to make sure that we were able to give them everything they needed, knowing that, you know, if you don't give them enough, it's harder to recreate. If you give them too much and they don't need that much, you can delete that, so that's easier. So the idea is that every instrument, every performance was mic'd as though you were a live concert show. And then we also put, you know, a 5.1 mic, a surround sound mic in the audience to capture that, and also various mics in the audience to capture different perspectives from the stage. So that right there is maybe 10 microphones just for audience cheers and claps and excitement. You know, and every actor's radio mic'd, and then, you know, even all the band members are, because from time to time they would interact with each other in that way. So the idea was just to capture as much as you could of all the music, all the instrumentation, all the singing, because since they're going to do everything live vocally, you had to make sure that you honored that in the ability to capture that feeling that you would have on stage.
Did Bradley Cooper have a general conversation with you guys about the various concerts and how the sound would affect an audience's emotional response to the way that it was presented to them? Just in terms of crowd volume in certain scenes, or if we're talking about the scene in the bar close to the beginning in the transvestite ballad, how the sound would be played differently?
I think on production we didn't have that. It was more or less just let's get it, you know, let's make sure to get it good. Also make sure that the idea was always that it sounded authentic to the audience. So I think these guys, you know, took what we did on set and made that experience for the audience.
It was always about keeping everything as authentic as possible. Authentic being at the concerts, if you're on stage, this is how the sound is from the musician's perspective, as opposed to the audience perspective looking at the stage. When you're in the bar, it's all about contrast and dynamic. So we did have, it was always hammered in all of us about keeping it real, keeping realism. Once, never getting you, the audience, out of the movie. And that was our main goal, was to keep that. But also we always had to honor the actors. They gave 110%. We all had to step up and honor their performances, acting-wise.
And in terms of references, did Bradley Cooper sort of look back to previous concert films or films featuring live footage?
Well, from my understanding, he was backstage on a, what was it, a Metallica show? Mm-hmm. And that's where he, you know, he was invited to that concert and he was behind the drum kit, and I think that's where he saw that perspective and decided that's where the camera should be. It should never be in the audience, because this is a story about Allie and Jackson Maine's relationship, not about the audience's relationship to them. You know, the concert audience, not the film audience. But so I think that's where he got that perspective for the first time, and kind of wanted to emulate that for the theatrical audience.
Tom, were you about to say something?
There was always definitely a very intentional plan, although I don't think we really had references, outside references, but every concert is totally unique. The crowds are all totally unique and very different sounding, you know, mostly recorded in that actual venue. You know, they're sweetened with other crowds from, most of the time, from the same venue, not necessarily that same moment, but just even the sound of the music, the sound of the crowds, everything is a deliberate, you know, change from venue to venue, so that they're all unique and different, and you know, the sizes all change and everything. So
it was also, and again, it just could be my impression of when I saw the film, but the relationship between sound and image, and not just the scale of the venue, but they much more than many other films that involve music. And we'll get on to Bohemian Rhapsody, which does a similar thing in a moment, but there was this very close relationship between the two.
Yeah, I think the idea is that, the camera is the audience, and if the camera is closer to that drum kit or closer to the guitar, that should be louder, as opposed to some, previous concert films or music films where it's just kind of a song that's being played out loud no matter where the camera is. So the idea of always having that perspective change, which is natural for any of us, if we're closer to anything, we hear it better. So I think that's where it really touches the audience and doesn't distract from the performance.
And
I think
in the crowds as well.
Yeah.
Wherever the camera was pointing, the crowds did their thing and then went away in a transition that you didn't feel.
Yeah.
I think, in most, musical type films, the music is kind of like the king, and you don't mess with the music too much, and you kind of shape a lot of things around that. And in this case, as Steve was just saying, perspective changes a lot, and it's a lot of subtle perspective changes. So, when she's moving the microphone around, we're doing little moves to make it feel like that's actually what's happening. When the camera's swinging around, things move subtly so that you feel like you actually just moved with that camera change or the perspective change. And yet, never make you consciously think about that.
I'm curious about the role of silence and just how important it can be in a film and how easily overlooked it is. Perhaps first of all, silence in the studio recording scenes. I was really impressed that wherever we went, there was a different kind of ambient space. And it set up this very complex landscape of sound within, if you could talk.
I think every perspective was authentic. I think that was a big thing for Bradley. If we were in a recording studio, we would really make it sound like she was in a vocal booth versus the engineer's perspective. All the studio scenes were that way. Some of the quiet scenes were actually some of the most challenging, or honestly, they took just as much labor as the big concert scenes. There were times, like the latter part of the film when she's playing the piano, alone after his death, the subtlety of, pedal squeaks and things like that were just as important as all the big scenes.
Yeah, I think when he's performs that first song at the opening of the film, and it's the stardom and all the chaos of being a rock star, and it comes into that door and it just shuts and goes really quiet. That kind of helps the audience to understand how I think his character is alone and lives in that silence. There might be all that rock fame and all that stuff, but as soon as he's alone, when the world goes quiet, his tinnitus kicks in, his drinking kicks in. Like, those are all the things that I think he copes with that silence.
I'm curious about the involvement that Lady Gaga had with sound in the film. Obviously, someone who's so used to working in a studio environment and having a very particular vision of what she should sound like.
Yeah, she was really concerned with the ambience out of the gate. Some of our early pre-production meetings, she really was, how are you guys going to create these reverbs and ambient spaces and all those things? So she really thought about the film as a whole, the soundscape as a whole, and her and Bradley were definitely on the same page. Like, every venue really needed to be authentic and true to the space.
Yeah, and her biggest concern that she let me know is, when she watches musicals or music films and people are talking and then the musical number starts, the whole world changes, sonically. And she wanted to avoid that at all costs, because that throws all of us out of the movie and goes, okay, here comes the music. And I think so her goal was, look, I don't want that. And so this needs to be live from the gate. And so that's really what drove our attempt at recording those crowds and recording the spaces as much as we did, so that it wouldn't be this drop in ambience to nothing to all of a sudden the song starts playing. So
for each of you, what did you find was the biggest challenge as you were working on the film?
The whole movie. The biggest challenge was, again, and I keep saying this, but at least for, I don't know, I can't speak for all of us, just keeping it as authentic as possible, but honoring each of these actors that had worked in this movie, they gave their heart and soul in it. And think about it. The first scene you see is a mega star singing that nobody's ever heard him sing before, and then to the world. So from the get-go, we were handed this responsibility to keep that vision. And so thinking of that as you're mixing, that's a pretty heavy weight to be holding up. And,
I think the fact that Bradley not only is an actor, but he's an actor on the level that he is a brilliant actor, and he's requiring that from everybody else in the cast. His perspective and his brain is in a place that he kind of required that from us also, which is a little bit unusual, you know, because a lot of people see this as sort of a technical thing, and although there's a lot of creativity in what we do, it becomes a little bit sometimes emotionally detached sometimes, and that was not going to fly on this. So, you know, it was a very, very sort of hyper-focused tune to sort of whatever is happening in the movie emotionally, and the juxtapositions of, say, a concert scene to, you know, even at the very beginning of the movie, he goes and he gets in his car and the whole world shuts out. And, you know, he wanted a feeling out of that. You know, it wasn't just about, oh, it should sound this way. It needs to feel this way. And everything in the movie was like that. I mean, little things where it was like if the dialogue wasn't balanced exactly perfectly with the backgrounds playing and the Foley playing, it became detached and odd. And, you know, and if we got it right, it really drew you into noticing every little nuance of each of the performers and what they were doing and really connecting to what they were doing.
I think on the production side, it was basically always being ready for everything, because Bradley doesn't like to rehearse. You know, there's not that traditional rehearsing, and Maddie, the cinematographer, likes to pick up a camera and hit record and start going if there's something special happening. So you just kind of had to sit there and watch all cameras at all times and be ready to either go, you know, a full live version with the band, you know, because they'll just start playing and it'll be something interesting, so you'll turn everything on live. And then it's also just a matter of just being prepared to, you know, kind of do any song. At a certain point, we just started putting all the songs in the session, just because he would just kind of walk away from the mic and then whisper, you know, okay, this one's Black Eyes. And then you'd say, okay, Black Eyes, and then hit play, and then we would start with that song. So that was one of the challenges, and it was just, but also just, you know, we had a good time doing it because it was such a fun set and such a fun way to make a movie.
And that atmosphere carried through post-production, by the way. Yeah, we all got on nicely.
Yeah, the songwriting just went up to the last hour as well. They would, you know, after set, they would go back in the studio at night. So there were so many versions of songs, constant updates. I mean, there were mornings, like on the way to set, I would get a call and go, she went in again and made a bunch of changes, and we're like trying to tether somebody's phone and download new parts. And, you know, you would get some sort of note from her like, well, prepared in a couple keys for today. And, you know, it was a lot of changes.
Kind of feels in spirit with the whole film, though, in a way.
Oh, yeah.
Just that, let's do it now.
Well, also, we did 2 concerts live, you know, we did one here in Glastonbury, which we had 3 minutes to film, jump on, film it, 3 minutes, and then jump off, in front of 110,000 people. And none of them heard them, you know, because we didn't amplify it into the audience because we don't want the music to get out a year and a half in advance. So we weren't sure if bottles were going to start being thrown.
I was going to say, you probably, if you listen really close on the soundtrack, you'll have some really offensive British comments being shouted out.
Yeah, which helped. Yeah.
Can you please join me in thanking the sound crew of Star is Born? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And up next, we have A Quiet Place. I have Fatima.
What's the big stuff?
We're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'd like to welcome Erik Aadahl, Ethan van der Rijn, and Brandon Procter.
It's Aadahl.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. When I was watching this film, I remember reading an article years ago about John Cage talking about finding this container that he walked into that apparently had no sound in it. And when he was in there, this sound became incredibly noisy, and he realized it was his own heartbeat. And watching this film, I just thought this isn't just a film that doesn't have much sound in it. There are layers and various levels of sound. And Erik, I read an interview with you, and you said every little sound is actually a big sound in this film.
No, that's right. And you know, the device that you're talking about, that John Cage mentioned, it's called an anechoic chamber. And these are the quietest places on Earth that you can go into because they're completely sonically isolated from the outside world. Not just with sound, actually, but with radio frequencies, and you know, they're often cased with lead, so even electromagnetic waves don't even come in. And you can walk into these things, and what's fascinating is, the first thing that happens is you lose your balance, because there's even the sounds you're making are not reflecting back at you. So, and people forget that we use our ears to orient ourselves and balance. So you're asked to sit down in an anechoic chamber. The second thing that happens is that after a few minutes, your ears kind of start to open up, and you start to hear your own body. And that's the circulatory system, the blood coursing through your veins, the cavity of your chest breathing, and these small sounds become really big sounds. And that was kind of the effect we were going for with A Quiet Place, was to create a track that opened the audience's ears up and eventually put them into the shoes of these characters and create kind of a sound experience. And that's what our director, John Krasinski, wanted to happen, and we knew it would be a huge challenge to try to achieve that.
It's interesting you bring up the John Cage reference, because when we started working on the film, you know, the first thing we did is we saw the first assembly, basically, of the movie, and I think what both Erik and I connected to most strongly was the love between these characters that you feel. And we thought, how can we lean into this, the intimacy that you feel between these characters and this tangible love between these members of this family that are so desperately trying to survive. And so the first thing we started doing was stripping out music, because there was basically wall-to-wall temp music. And once we did that, we realized, how can we get closer to these characters? And with the daughter, Regan's character, she's deaf in the movie, and she's played by an actress who's deaf in real life, Millicent Simmons. And John described to us how Millie on set became kind of the spirit guide for the actors. She taught all the actors American Sign Language, which they use in the movie. And so when we started working with the sound design on the film, we were thinking how we want to get closer to these characters. We want to feel what they're feeling. And with Millie's character, we were like, okay, she's deaf. This is a world where sound is everything. If you make too much sound, you will get killed. And so in a way, Millie became our spirit guide for sort of unlocking the sound design to the film, because we had a description from John of Millie's experience of how she experiences the world when her cochlear implant is turned on. And she described it as being sort of a low rumble, almost, you know, hearing as touch in a way. And Erik and I immediately related it to our own experiences being in anechoic chambers, where, as Erik has described, what you really hear once your ears open up after 5 or 10 minutes is the sound of, your own body, your heart faintly pumping in the background, your nervous system sort of buzzing away. And so we based the sound design on those experiences. For these moments in the film when we're in Millie's sonic perspective and she has her cochlear implant turned on. And then, as you know, there's 3 moments in the film where she actually turns it off. And these are the 3 moments in the film where we go to complete silence, digital zero, which, if you think about it, when do any of us in today's world ever have the chance to experience total and complete silence? So the first time we tried that in our editing room, we were both like, it literally took our breath away because it's such an unusual experience to have. And also in the context of the movie, it immediately connected us in such a deep and powerful way with her experience and her vulnerability that it became very moving, and it, in a way, sort of unlocked all the potential in the story and in these characters' experience.
It's interesting you talk about moments of like pure cinematic silence, because people talk about silent cinema, but silent cinema was always accompanied by music. And the one thing I think that does become very clear when you remove all sound is that the tempo of time itself changes. And I was just wondering, as you were experimenting with the sound design and with sound as a whole in the film, what conversations you might have had with the editor and with John Krasinski about the fact that not the film will come to a grinding halt, but there will be a slower tempo to it.
Yeah, in fact, we had to think of that as the film as a whole as well. I mean, how often and how long can we go to digital silence? Because we also didn't want to take anybody out of the film or out of the story. We wanted you to be a part of the story and not think, oh, is there something wrong in the theater? And then as we get further down the film, and we're actually kind of creating more and more silence as we get to the end, we experimented with how much we could go, and we didn't really know until we played the whole entire film together instead of being in reels, the whole thing, to see, is this going to work? So are we going to actually go with the characters here and actually feel what they're feeling? Because it really was following their journey and what's going on and following Millie's journey.
And I think one interesting psychoacoustic thing is one might expect that when you turn things down or off, it slows it down, but in a funny way, it actually makes it more engaging. I think we're so used to, the convention these days is more, how big can you get? And I think volume kind of plateaued in a film creates a numbing effect, and I think it actually pushes an audience away. And in a funny way, when you start to strip things away and really make people have to pay attention to sound, especially in this film where sound is deadly, and if a character makes a sound that's too loud, they'll attract these creatures who have hyper acute hearing and they'll be dead. So there's an added tension there. But the quiet actually kind of makes an audience lean in a funny way. And it might slow down time, but I don't think it slows the film down. And it's a very kind of funny psychoacoustic effect. But it was something that we were very aware of and wanted to really play with. Sound is kind of, Walter Murch described sound as this thing that sneaks in through the back door. Images come in through the front door, but sound has this very emotionally manipulative power that works on the kind of most primitive parts of our brain, the reptilian parts of our brain that evolved before our ability to see. And I think because of that, we're so easily emotionally manipulated by sound. And it was kind of that invisible hand we were thinking about the entire time making A Quiet Place. It was like a gift platter given to us by John Krasinski, just as sound designers. I mean, what a dream. So that was kind of the thought process the entire time. Like, we should not be afraid of taking things out just because it's not done. Actually, we wanted to embrace that. And I think because it wasn't a $200 million film, we didn't have a studio breathing down our neck, we kind of felt like we could take these strange experimental risks and, you know, knowing that it might not work, though it was working for us. I mean, we didn't know, there were no test audience screenings or anything. We were on the final mixing stage in New York, and we got the call back, like we'd just a few days left of final mixing, and we showed it, it premiered at South by Southwest, and they're like, okay, don't mess up the movie, standing ovation, the experiment worked, and we kind of went, oh, okay, well, that's good. So.
And we talked as well as, you know, removing music, it was helping us to actually establish these rules, you know, early on. And we had to actually take out the music or extend shots to kind of actually show what we're doing here, attempting to do. So kind of pull everybody into the film and then go to these, you know, perspectives, these sounds perspectives, right away to kind of say, this is going to be the language that we're going to have to follow through the film.
It was interesting in a way because this is a movie where, more than any movie I think we've done, where the sound design really started to drive how the movie was getting put together. As we're putting the sound design together, we realized there were certain shots, like as Brandon just indicated, specifically with the creature, and realizing, okay, we want to go into the creature's sonic perspective like we're doing with other characters. And we realized in order to do that in an effective way, we needed the shots of the creature's ears opening to become elongated. So we would have enough time to first establish the audience's sort of point of view of the environmental sounds, and then morph it into the creature's sonic perspective, which is hyperacute. So it was amazing because, you know, we started realizing this. We'd put a call into John Krasinski. He immediately called ILM and said, you know, we need to extend this shot. And then 3 days later, we'd get back sort of a temp, you know, elongated shot. And that's sort of an experience we don't normally get to have on most films. And by the same token, the picture editing was, you know, adjusting constantly to what we were finding in the sound design, how things needed to be driven, and that was a really wonderful and unique experience.
And to talk about, you know, just to have the timer, and you go cut to the ear, and that's what you're going to hear and enhance is the sound of that timer. Originally, they would cut away to Emily, and it kind of breaks that. So if you have timer than ear, without audibly telling him, you can actually enhance that sound and actually go, that is what the creature's hearing, without breaking away to another, you know, cutaway shot.
Yeah, just to, I mean, this might be obvious, but things like that, you know, the sound was kind of more so than, you know, there's almost no dialogue in the film at all, so sound was really kind of telling the story in place of exposition, creating the logic of how do the creatures perceive reality? What's our audience's reality? At a certain point in the film, the deaf daughter Regan is interacting one-on-one with the creature, and sound has to tell this kind of complicated story of both of their sonic perspectives, and then how somehow they interfere with each other. The creatures have kind of an electrical magnetic component that interferes with Regan's cochlear implant, her hearing aid. And though the two of these characters are kind of represent different poles, one is blind with hyperacute hearing, one has no hearing but can see, but somehow they're united through this interference with the hearing aid, which winds up becoming the ultimate weapon in the film. And it's sound that has to set up these plot points and which then pay off in the finale of the film. So, I mean, that was, John was saying the whole time, John Krasinski, through the whole process, like, you guys are doing the heavy lifting here, and which was simultaneously thrilling and a little terrifying.
Yeah, it's about, you know, how quiet can we go, for how long, you know. I kept, you know, talking to John, like, I'm afraid we might be going too quiet. You know, are we gonna, you know, you want them to actually hear the sounds, the macro sounds when we're close up to them, you know, and not have it be, you know, silent completely, because then those silent, you know, pieces in the film lose their impact if you don't have, like, just a little bit of noise.
I definitely think this is a film that should have had a sign on every cinema door saying no food and drink consumption at all throughout this movie.
Well, what was thrilling when we started hearing those stories when it came out that people were terrified to eat popcorn in the theater, it was wonderful because in a way it made like the audience the hunted as well. It made them active participants in the movie and they could relate to the characters on screen.
Oh my God, you're really twisted.
It was thrilling. We loved it. But, you know, and then there's these moments where we have the Neil Young song come in and where everyone could kind of like take a breath, cough, eat their popcorn for a minute, and then get back on the ride.
I had friends that actually they said they'd go home after the film and they were still trying to be quiet. They were trying to actually, so they were participating even when they went home after the film.
Please join me in thanking the team from A Quiet Place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next up, we have Bohemian Rhapsody. As I said, it's getting smaller and smaller as we go on. We're going to move close together on the sofa, make it nice and intimate. Welcome, Nina Hartstone and John Warhurst.
Thank you.
Like all the other films, so many things to talk about. Let's start off with the fact that, in contrast to Bradley Cooper's film, this is a film in which you've had to balance iconic recordings that most people around the world have probably heard playing once or twice, with those required for certain scenes in the film where you didn't have music. Could you talk about the challenge of actually bringing those two together and creating what we end up seeing on the screen?
When I first started on the film, it was very early on. It was sort of in the pre-production phase, and there was all sorts of meetings about the script and about how the film could be made. Because at that stage, nobody actually knew that the script. It sort of was still in. It was almost there, but just things were still being changed around a bit. So, and certain scenes would come and go, and you sort of think, well, how on earth can we do that? You know, how can we create that? Would it be playback? Would we play that back on set, or would Rami be up for trying to perform that? And so we sort of went through and worked out. But then soon after that, we were told that actually Queen were completely behind the film, which was great news. And not only were they behind the film, but we could go to the studio and have a listen through all their material and see what we could use for the film. So obviously that was a good day at work to go to Queen's studio and listen to all their multi-tracks and see what we could use. It became apparent that actually they have a huge archive. They've been multi-track recording their sort of concerts since the beginning of time, really, since they started out. They'd got recordings from 1974 that were sort of 16-track recordings that sounded great, that sounded really good. So that was a good start. Not only did they have that, but they also had, many would say, okay, we need a live version of Keep Yourself Alive. And they say, okay, well, we have about sort of 22 versions of that. Which one do you want? And so then it sort of became down to more of a point of saying, well, which one would you like to be in the film? And so that was obviously, once we knew that they were behind us, that did make things a lot easier. And then, then we started mapping out what recordings we have, what we didn't have, and then how we could do the film from there.
And I could be wrong in this, but I read somewhere that there was a degree of manipulation of the actual existing recordings in order to sort of ensure that Rami didn't sound that different.
Yeah, well, that was one of the issues, was because obviously there were scenes in the film where we knew that there's no way there's a Freddie Mercury recording exists of that scene, so that would need to be created. And then discussions were, well, is Rami going to have a go? Should we get someone that sounds like Freddie? And that's where we got a Freddie sound-alike to sort of help out on some of those scenes as well. But then we started thinking, but then that's three people. I don't know if there's ever been a lead character in a film before that's had three people doing their voice. So that's when myself and Nina started talking about different ways of how we could try and make these three different voices one person. So, but yeah, do you want to speak about
Yeah, so,
doing that?
I mean, basically, we used Freddie, obviously, as much as we could in the film. Rami did such an amazing job at recreating the physicality and the performance of Freddie and holding the audience in his hand on stage as all the way through the film. So we wanted to use Freddie's voice as much as we could, but obviously it always needed to feel like it was coming out of Rami's mouth. I mean, and essentially what we're doing, which is something that is quite difficult in sound, is kind of doing a revoice. You know, you're revoicing your main character, at least while they're singing. So it was very important to us that we made that feel as authentic and real as possible. In order to do that, we recorded, obviously Rami was singing for his life on stage every time he was performing, particularly through Live Aid and obviously the other concerts in the film. So we had all the recordings of that, and we also got Rami into Goldcrest and Abbey Road and had him re-recording all manner of kind of breaths and lip smacks and inhales and mic blows and all those kind of things. And it was very detailed editing, really, to get to use little pieces of Rami in between the sung vocals and make sure that they blended together and all felt like one cohesive voice coming out of Rami's mouth on stage, and kept, because it was just so crucial at that point, particularly during Live Aid, with such a long sequence, that you never ever felt that pushed away from him. You always felt like his performance was building through, and that was Rami singing as Freddie. Rami done such an amazing job with the physicality of it all, so we just needed to do the same with his voice, really.
And how much of a challenge was getting the sound as right as you got it for the entire Live Aid sequence, with the cheering crowds, with all the noise backstage and everything coming into it?
That was obviously, that was always going to be the biggest challenge. One of the anxieties about that was, well, you can actually go on YouTube and just click on a link and watch Live Aid, and anybody can do that. So
it's a very flat sound. That's the problem.
Well, it's a very so that was what we discussed. How can we put it on in a cinema and actually make it different, make it better than just watching it on YouTube? We were very fortunate. There was a guy called Jeff Griffin who was told on the day that you're not allowed to record any of the performances. He was told to not record anything. But he thought it would be criminal to not record things. So he ran a multi-track in his BBC truck. And we managed to get hold of from the Live Aid Trust and through Jim Beach and the band, get hold of the multi-track of Live Aid. So that was a great start. That was a really good start. You know, as the other guys were talking before about the sort of perspective changes, it's so important to get that. You need to, you know, with the live intro, when you close up with the kick drum, you want to hear the kick drum. When you sort of see the guitar, you want to hear more guitar. But obviously, the thing that we didn't have, the thing that was going to be the biggest issue, was the crowd was trying to recreate those 90,000 people at Live Aid. They were talking as well about how there was going to be a roving camera around Live Aid and how we were going to see Live Aid from a whole manner of different perspectives.
And so far up as well, aerials.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Coming all the way down, sometimes from the back of the stadium, sometimes you're in the middle of the stadium surrounded by people. And I've done other concert films before, and I know that one of the issues is although you try to record the audience, you actually get more of the slap of the PA onto those audience mics. So when you start to push up the audience, actually all it does is distort the music. The music becomes much more sort of flabby, if you like. It becomes much more loose because you get more. It's like reverb almost. You're adding into it because it's the PA. So I knew it'd be very important to get sort of crowds separate. We needed those crowds to be separate. And there was a second unit shoot day. They had 600 people coming to do all these crane shots of the individual crowd. And I asked the line producer if it'd be okay if in between camera sets, because they're very tight with time on shoot days. They don't really like to give you too much time. Obviously, they have a whole list of things they want to get through. So I said, between camera setups, can we record the crowd? And he said, yeah, sure, you know, that's fine, but it'll have to be quick. You can have it 5-minute chunks at a time. So we said, fine. And I thought, how on earth do we record 600 people? We can't give out 600 sets of headphones. So after thinking about it for a while, I thought, actually, the way that Freddie did his Deo was we could do it a similar way because we had a huge PA there on the day. So we chopped up this session sort of line by line, and we played this crowd a line for them to then repeat back the line that they just heard in the gap. It took a couple of times to get it right, because they knew the songs, and they always wanted to sing the next line, and I kept saying, no, you have to sing the line that you've just heard coming back to you. So we did this, and we tried to get a rhythm with it as well, so the gaps between the lines were sort of roughly in time until the next line. So we did multiple passes with this 600 crowd. And then you did some more, didn't you, for the more medium crowd?
Yeah, so then I recorded the loop group. We got about 40 people in, and I did not want to record it inside because it's going to be in Wembley Stadium. It needs to sound right, it needs to sound exterior, and I wanted lots of perspectives as well. So we didn't go into an ADR theatre. We went and used some exterior space at Shepperton Studios and set up on a weekend when there wasn't going to be other noises of other productions going on. We got about 8 mics out. We had left, centre, right at the front. We had a guy on a boom so we could move it around. We got plenty of movement within the crowd that were there. Wheeled out a big monitor, a load of headphones, had another 3 mics in the back, and then a very distant one to get just that real super kind of distant mic that we could place in certain shots that we had within the Live Aid cut. And yeah, we kept them going through, singing along to Live Aid, doing whoops and cheers, shouting names, and it was just so important. I mean, you see in the film that the audience that you see, the ones that were recorded on set, they are going for it. They were really enjoying it, and I think on the shoot day it was so important, wasn't it, that they had that big PA, so they felt like they were at a concert. They're jumping, they're whooping, so we had to do the same with them. So it was a full day. I felt like an aerobics instructor of making them jump up and down, punch the air, and so you could hear that movement and excitement in their voices. So that then provided the sort of the next layer down of crowd size, of where you could kind of, when you're in the midst of the crowd, you can hear a few of those individuals around you. It's not the big scale crowd, and it's not the individuals that we did then shoot later. The sync stuff we did shoot in an ADR theatre, so that when you see one person's mouth open, every single individual that you see then has a voice as well. So we had those different layers.
I think we always imagined it as sort of 3 layers. So there was the large crowd, so the more immediate around you, and then the individuals. And because we wanted it to go with this roving camera, then everything was sort of moving in waves. So it would, whenever you arrived on the shot that you were looking at, that the sound was already kind of rising up to meet that shot. So it would peak on that shot. So you would never sort of feel any kind of jolt or cut to the next shot. But whenever you landed on a shot, you always felt the kind of where you were in the stadium, sort of presence around you.
What's quite interesting, and it's perhaps a bit of a contrast with particularly the smaller gig scenes of A Star Is Born, which is capturing this verisimilitude of what it's like to be in a gig. I found it quite expressionistic at times in Bohemian Rhapsody. The clarity by which you captured the conversations as a band was playing, as many other things were going on. But it added this other element that then, as we travel further into Freddie's psyche, as the film moves on, becomes increasingly expressionistic. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there was always an overall sort of, we discussed overall about the design of the film from beginning to end, and how that would sort of track his journey. So when we see them in the early days, then it was meant to be a bit more sort of messy, a bit more raw, because the gigs were, obviously they were even being heckled and whatever. But it was growing throughout the film. So you would as Freddie and the band developed, then the sort of the audiences, the sound, if you like, would grow with them as they developed throughout the whole film, obviously peaking in Live Aid.
I'm getting signal that we have to move on, unfortunately. Can you please join me in thanking Nina and Jon?
Thank you.
And finally, I can just say a name now. Can I welcome to the stage James Mather for Mission Impossible 4.
I'm going to lie. The whole thing to myself.
Massage your head. Well.
The sound couch. Well, this is going to be brief, I think.
Yeah.
Just me, I'm afraid.
So we've got 30 seconds. What was the size of the... Talking about size, just you on stage. What was the size of the team for the...
It's just me. But it is. But it's nice to be here.
You look very relaxed. I feel like we're suddenly transformed into a morning TV chat show. What was the size of the team on the film?
We had about 12 people in total. And we worked over a very long period because there was so little green screen material being shot because he does everything. We were getting sequences throughout the shoot to work on from very early days. So the crew kept expanding and contracting all the way through.
And you start early on it. I'm curious about the conversations that you had with Christopher Mcquarrie. You have some extraordinary set pieces. Obviously, as you said, they are set pieces that are actually filmed that Tom Cruise was involved with. About capturing the sound in each of these.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Munro, who was the recordist, has a team of people that get a huge amount of material. But obviously they're restricted to dialogue only. That's the key thing. And they had, I think for the helicopter scene, Chris went to the Swedish military who were designing in-ear bone mics that would record dialogue through the bone, through the skull, rather than through the voice. Which are interesting, but not usable, really. They're kind of, you can decipher what the dialogue is, but it's not really. It doesn't work with music and effects as well. So we always had a really interesting, clear guide from them as to what they wanted, where they wanted it. But much in the way that others were talking, because of the nature of the rhythm of the film in its entirety, these set pieces were the first things to do. And so consequently, as we worked through them, and the music, Lorne Balfe was working on the score from early days as well, the size and the scale of the set pieces changed, and the edit within it changed, so that the sound could follow the rhythm, and the picture would dictate a rhythm. The sound would then accompany the rhythm, and it would change it slightly. So then the picture would change, alter. So throughout the whole process, we were giving mix downs to Eddie Hamilton, the editor, who would always want to run it with as full a track as possible, and always work more or less with sound effects and not music to get that kind of adrenaline. And like painting, you'd put so many layers on, and then as you get more confident towards the end, you start peeling away layers to reveal detail and the storyline moments that were really important. But at the beginning, it's just everything on it, throw everything at it, make it loud and bombastic, and because the effects are what are going to drive the cut for Eddie. That's what he wanted. And that Tom's big note at the very beginning of the whole process was the perspective is really important. Because I'm doing all these effects, these stunts, I want the audience to believe that they're with me and that they feel that what I'm going through for this process, or whichever character we're focusing on. So it's very important that we got that perspective kind of sorted at the beginning, that we didn't just sort of have an engine running all the way through everything, that we had to chop and change. And so from the get-go, we were doing quite fine sort of mix work to make these sequences almost like standalone sort of promo sections in a way.
Yeah, there are a couple of set pieces I want to talk about specifically, and it's interesting you say about perspective there, because one of the things I was thinking about the helicopter climax is the marked shift from point of view to distance shots. And was there any challenge in it? Because it's not just point of view, you are right in the middle of what's unfolding. Yeah. And it's almost like a crunching noise, and then suddenly you're pulling back.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Chris made a comment post after the film was out about the courage of taking music away and letting sequences run for the energy that is within them, pictorially and with sound design. And I think in those occasions, it was really beneficial to the sound design to have music just punch through on some of the wide, more dramatic, open sequences, so that it could define the detailed work that was going on when you're in the helicopter or when the rotors are hitting each other. So that kind of dynamic shift, the whole mix ended up feeling very dynamically shifting quite hard, but maintaining as much detail as we could so that you really felt that you were being thrown into the situation, then you're being pulled out of it. And those were the moments where music really, really drove that section, the helicopter sequence in particular. There are other sequences that Chris said, I don't want I don't want to have music in there. I want it to be either the bikes or the cars, or, you know, we'll just go with sound effects for that. So when the music did kick in, it had a reason and a purpose to drive that next section through. And, you know, I think the scene that was the most interesting for that was the halo jump, which we...
With added lightning.
With added lightning. Exactly, yes. And a few other things. But that was one of those challenging moments where you go, okay, he's jumping out of a plane. It's obviously an incredible stunt, and we want to enhance that and make sure it's as exciting and visceral for the audience as possible. But whose perspective do we follow? Are we watching him jumping out of a plane and viewing it as an audience, or are we him? Or are we Walker, who's obviously, you know, unconscious for half of it? And so we tried recording in different methods of recording, using helmets to record within, and trying all sorts of different textures, microphone techniques. And it ended up being more and more about being in Tom's perspective, because that was the jeopardy, and that was the bit that the audience had to relate to. So the point where he gets hit by the added lightning, and it goes silent, was like, it's interesting hearing everybody talk about the way that we use the tools of our trade. The tools of our trade, the colour that we paint with is sound. And, you know, everybody has different ways of applying it and using it, which is what's so wonderful. And silence is everybody's favourite tool, because it gives you the ability to start again from zero, or go rapidly to zero. And it gives that dynamic shift is so important to being able to make the audience believe that there's more than what they're seeing. And it can be a jolting thing, it can be a very discreet and subtle, emotive thing, but it's still the same thing. It's still the same element that makes people go, I'm not comfortable about this. So that was a very challenging sequence. I wanted it to stay quieter for much longer, and when you've got a room full of people, somebody goes, it's too long, we need to hear something, and then they go, what about a bit of Tom in there? And everyone always goes, yeah, that's great, let's put a bit of Tom in there. But it was a very collaborative process, because we were on it from such an early start, and there was a lot of decisions made about the soundtrack over a much longer period than I'd normally have on a film. And that made it fun. And you know, we're tied into a franchise, so you have to respect the history and the sort of the great work that people have done beforehand on the previous films. So you just try and make it as exciting and as believable as possible. And there has to be an element of fun with it. You know, the fight scene in the bathroom has got a rhythm to it that is almost slapstick, and you have to make that, the sound can't be too authentic in a way. It has to have a
bone crunching.
No, it has to be. It has to be a little more than you'd expect, but it also has to have humour in it, which is fun. It's a great challenge. You know, fight scenes are like, they've been around forever. Everybody's done fight scenes. How do you do a fight scene differently? Well, it's the relationship in it within the characters, and it's the idea that one guy's kicking two guys, kicking their ass, and how are they going to get back? That's funny, that's ridiculous. And the way they do it is ridiculous. So we kind of had to make it really punchy and heavy and hard, but also we had to make people laugh. We had to have it, you know, slightly entertaining. And there was music all the way through that. That was one of the scenes where you come out of a nightclub and there's this thumping behind the door nightclub beat, and it was there all the way through. So we were like, oh, this is going to be tough. This is going to be, you know, it's going to get really boring after a while of just a low-end thump. And that was one of the moments when Chris said, well, let's just try with that, and then let's just bring it in slowly. And so Chris wears hearing aids, and it's really interesting hearing, as these guys are talking, somebody who listens to things in a very different way. And his perspective was really enlightening at times, because you go, okay, well, yeah, that's a great idea, let's try it. And he'd go, okay, I can't hear anything now. I can't hear the music at all. And we go, no, it's there, look. Somebody had a Swiss ball that was sitting, and I said, look, sit on the Swiss ball. Sat on it, oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah, I can feel it. I can feel it in the vibrations. So, yeah, it was a lot of experiments.
And one last question. Again, it sort of comes back to the silence thing. And you sort of touched on it. It's not just having silence, but punctuating silence. For anyone who's not seen it, I don't want to give away, but there's you think something's happening, and then you realize it's not happening in the Paris sequence. That suddenly we're taken back, and you realize it's not a dream.
Oh, yes, yes.
But it's the gunshot. You have a leader. He's going to do something you don't expect. You hear the gunshot, and suddenly you're brought back.
Yeah.
It is very interesting to watch an action movie, and suddenly for someone to say, "Yeah, you know what? This won't work unless you go against the grain and you don't have sound."
One of the things I love about the job that we all do, is that you have those wonderful moments where you're sitting there with everything on the board, all the sound is there, you've gone through and you've mixed it one way, and then somebody will say, well, let's try it a different way. And it's that confidence of somebody saying, I wouldn't mind hearing it just for the next playback, let me hear it so that there's no sound. And you think you've done everything you could possibly do in every possible way, but there's always another way, and there's always another opinion. And that's one of those sequences where somebody says, why don't we just try it muted? No, well, let's just try it with a bit less. Let's just hold it. Well, that doesn't work. Let's go. So that whole mix process is the culmination of all the attention and all the detail and all the hard work that's gone into recording it and laying it up and having it pre-dubbed. And that moment, that period of time when you're really exploring the opportunities of telling the story with sound purely, it's all your time. It's just the sound people and the picture people are coming in to give their opinions. And it's a wonderful period of time. It's a wonderful experimental. You learn about yourself. You learn about the people you're working with. You get closer to something you thought you couldn't get closer to. So every time we went through a day of mixing, there'd be something that would happen that we'd go, well, that's not how we thought it would work, but that's great. It's brilliant. Let's leave it. And a lot of things got left. A lot of things happened really early, and then, we'd mix for a week, and then they'd go away, and they'd be shooting. We'd send stuff off. As I said, it was a long period of time, but the last month of final dubbing was great. It was it was really entertaining for all of us, I think.
Please join me in thanking James Mather. Thank you.